I'm Justin Johnson. I work for a pretty small consulting firm in Vermont, up in the Northeast. But previous to that, I was worked for the Vermont state government. I was heavily involved in the original design and implementation of the RGGI program, and have been involved in the carbon markets on the East Coast ever since. One of my roles is to work as AIDA's East Coast representative. So anyone, if you're a member of AIDA, you've probably talked to me on phone calls or seen me at events like this, mainly talking about the Northeast. What we're hoping to do today, as you can see, is just say a little bit about where things are with the North American compliance markets, where they might be headed. This builds a little bit on the plenary session this morning. And I will throw in a little bit about the East Coast that we don't get from some of the other folks we have up here. And I'd just like to introduce them. We have Joel Creswell from Washington State. We have Eva Berton from the Canadian Federal Environment and Climate Change Department, and Mark Sippola from the Air Resources Board here in California. So thank you all for your time. And I thought what we would do is just have each of the speakers say a little bit about the current state of what they've been working on, the program, where it's at, where it's going. Then we will have a couple questions from me. They'll probably won't want to answer them, so then we'll move quickly to the audience and we'll go from there. So I'll hand it over to Joel to get us started.
Great. Well, thanks, Justin, and good morning, everybody. So couple of updates on Washington's cap and trade program to set the table here. Our cap and invest program, we're in California, the language just sticks with you. Our cap and invest program was stood up in a very short period of time. It launched just last year, 2023, and is moving full speed ahead. As you probably heard this morning, we are seeking to join the California and Québec carbon market and released a joint announcement with those jurisdictions expressing our desire to explore potential linkage together. And our program is generating significant valuable revenue, billions of dollars so far, that is being invested in Washington's economy, decarbonizing the economy and reducing air pollution and helping overburdened communities become more resilient to climate change. We hosted our 5th quarterly auction since the program's inception earlier this month on March 6th. And so we have a strong history of auctions. They've all been fully subscribed so far. The settlement price did decrease significantly in this most recent auction compared to the previous auction, but the demand for allowances remains strong. We had more bids than allowances available, and more than 90% of those allowances were sold to covered businesses in Washington. The rest went to general market participants, and that tells us that covered entities in Washington state are still planning ahead for their compliance obligations in the future. Now, I want to move on and talk a little bit about linkage. I mentioned our joint announcement this morning. In addition to that, our legislature in the session, the 2024 session that ended earlier this month, passed a bill at Ecology's request that removed some barriers to linkage, made some changes to our statute that will help us better align our carbon market with the California and Quebec markets in pursuit of linkage. And there are a couple of reasons why we're doing that. First of all, our statute actually directed us when our program was stood up to pursue linkage with other jurisdictions. Second of all, we think that that is the most important tool that we have in operating our cap and invest program to ensure price stability. And that price stability is going to provide greater certainty to businesses in Washington, to the covered entities, so that they can invest in decarbonization. That helps them plan around what prices are going to be in the future so that they can figure out how much to invest this year and in 5 years and in 10 years in decarbonizing their operations. A couple of next steps on linkage from Washington's perspective. Obviously, linkage requires all 3 jurisdictions to come together and reach mutual agreement. But on our side, what we're doing now that our request legislation has been passed by the legislature is this spring, we're going to kick off a rulemaking where we codify some of the changes made in the regulation to further harmonize our markets. And then depending on how things go in California and Quebec, at some point when all three jurisdictions are ready, we'll begin the process of developing a linkage agreement together. Through that, Washington has a couple of specific steps that I wanted to outline that we're required to carry out. One of them is our statute has some criteria that linkage needs to meet for Washington in order for us to be able to link with the other jurisdictions. And that includes things like making sure that it will decrease compliance costs, making sure that it will bring benefits and not cause harms to overburdened communities in Washington or in the linked jurisdictions, and then also ensuring that Washington is still achieving its carbon emissions reductions that are required by law. Another piece of the process that we have to carry out in Washington is we have to do an environmental justice assessment of linkage. That's a process that requires us to assess the probable impacts on overburdened communities in the state, so there's a lot of community input. We reach out to tribes and communities around the state as part of that process. And then we are thinking that the earliest a linkage agreement could feasibly be completed would be late 2025, possibly later than that. So I also want to talk a little bit about just timelines and upcoming deadlines, because we're, again, early in our program, and so we're still in an area where we're hitting firsts on a lot of milestones. So we're coming up on our first emissions reporting deadline since the program was stood up. Of course, we've been collecting emissions data in Washington for quite some time now, but this is the first one for 2023 emissions, which was the first year the program was in effect. And this is also going to give us the first very early indicator of what the covered entities are doing, where their emissions are since the program was stood up. So our emissions reporting deadline is the end of this month, March 31st. For most entities, electric power entities have to report by June 1st. And then we have our first third-party verification going on this year as well, and that is due to be completed by August 1st, and then the compliance deadline for 30% of 2023 emissions is November 1st. So lots of exciting deadlines coming up, exciting for us anyway. And then the last thing I'll say before I hand it over is I wanted to talk just a little bit about offsets. Again, we're new in this space, but we have issued offset credits to 3 different projects. Those have all been for the destruction of ozone-depleting substances. In our initial rulemaking, we adopted 4 protocols from California's cap-and-trade program. That includes forestry, urban forestry, livestock, and ozone-depleting substances. And then we just recently kicked off a rulemaking where we're going to consider updates and revisions to the adopted offset protocols. And then we're also going to consider the possibility of a new offset protocol around blue carbon. So with that, I will hand it over to Eva, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thanks very much, Joel. Yeah, so I mean, this morning, Judy Meltzer, the DG of the Carbon Markets Bureau, Environment Climate Change Canada, spoke to markets sort of more broadly in Canada. So I thought I'd do a little bit more of a deep dive on Canada's greenhouse gas offset credit system. As she noted this morning, it's a regulated, it's a compliance-based offset system. It was launched in June of 2022. I think it's the only national sort of compliance-based offset system, and it's an important part of the Government of Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan. As Judy noted, we've got regulations which set out requirements that apply to all project types and establish the system, as well as federal offset protocols which contain the quantification methods and the requirements that are specific to a given project type. And so those federal protocols are developed outside of the regulations through extensive consultation. They're published in a compendium of federal offset protocols, which is available on our website. And the system is really designed to encourage, voluntary activities that generate reductions which, go beyond the business as usual practices, legal requirements, and that are not already subject to carbon pollution pricing mechanisms. And maybe before I go on, there was a question this morning about how the federal and the provincial systems work together in Canada, and I thought it might be worth clarifying that a little bit, because there's sometimes confusion about where the federal system does apply. So we apply, it's national in scope. We apply everywhere in Canada, not just in jurisdictions that might be covered by the federal backstop. So credits could be generated anywhere in the country, but we do have designed the system in a way that complements provincial systems that are in place. So The provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec have all had provincial systems, offset systems in place for quite some time. And sort of to avoid any unintended consequences in disrupting those provincial compliance markets, the federal offset protocols only apply in jurisdictions that don't already have a provincial system or a protocol covering the same activity. So we kind of complement provincial systems through our protocol applicability rules. Environmental integrity is key, so robust requirements in place to ensure that the reductions that are generated are real, additional, quantifiable, verifiable, unique, and permanent. And the credits, as Judy noted, can be used for compliance by facilities that are covered under the federal output-based pricing system, which is the industrial emissions trading system at the federal level. But there are also being considered for compliance use under the oil and gas emissions cap that's under development, as well as clean electricity regulations that are under development, and no limits on use. So we do expect the demand to come from some other sources as well, such as greening government operations or towards corporate net zero targets. So protocols are required to generate credits. As Judy noted, we've got 2 that are published right now. One is landfill methane recovery and destruction. That applies everywhere except for BC, Alberta, and Quebec. And then we also have a reducing greenhouse gas emissions from refrigeration systems, which applies everywhere. And just to note on that one, because it's also sometimes confusing, that's not an ODS protocol. So it's the only protocol of its type in Canada. The way it works is that it generates reductions by retrofitting or installing new refrigeration systems to reduce applies to industrial and commercial refrigeration or air conditioning systems. And those systems, can leak refrigerants either during their normal operations or charge-ups or at the end of life. And so what the protocol is intending to do is to incent the transition away from high global warming potential refrigerants to lower global warming potential ones. And that would be the way through retrofitting systems to use lower global warming refrigerants, or installing new systems would be the way to generate reductions under that protocol. So a little bit of a difference there. We had also recently published a draft back in, well, not so recently, June of last year, of an improved forest management on private land protocol. So the public comment period for that wrapped up. We've actually completed the analysis of comments and are hoping to publish the final version of that protocol in the coming weeks. So that one's really intended to provide an incentive for landowners and proponents to implement forest management activities that increase carbon sequestration within managed forests from activities such as reducing harvest, thinning, or increasing rotation ages. Beyond that one, another 4 protocols are also under development. So we had published the draft of a reducing enteric methane emissions from beef cattle for comment back in December. The public comment period for that wrapped up in February. So we're in the process of analyzing those comments and hope to publish a final protocol there this summer. And then also looking to publish a draft of an avoidance of manure methane emissions from anaerobic digestion or other treatments protocol sometime this spring. That protocol would be aimed to incentivize the installation of manure treatments that reduce methane emissions associated with manure anaerobic storage, such as in lagoons and tanks. And anaerobic digestion is the most common treatment, but we're also looking at some other ones, such as manure acidification. And then also in the agriculture space, continuing to work on an enhanced soil organic carbon protocol. That one's a complicated one. We've kind of said from the beginning it would take a little bit of time to develop, but we are looking at wrapping up some key analysis and research this summer, and then at which point we'd be able to kind of determine when a draft protocol might be published. And on a bit of a different track, also have started the development of a direct air carbon dioxide capture and sequestration protocol. So research and analysis on that one's also underway, and we hope to be able to confirm timelines for publication of a draft protocol on that one sometime soon. In terms of other work, we're also actually continuing to work hard with Indigenous communities and organizations to deliver Carbon Markets 101 type of training material. So we have developed a greenhouse gas offsets toolkit that's been available English and French, but also in 3 different Indigenous languages. I'm looking to get that available in a 4th Indigenous language soon and continue to add materials to that toolkit, as well as initiate the development of an improved forest management on public lands protocol, which is of a high degree of interest to our Indigenous communities in Canada. And then finally, we also recently launched our registry. So transparency is key. So to share information on our projects and credits, we registered our first project in the fall, landfill methane recovery and destruction project. There are a number of refrigeration projects that are currently underway, and we've heard a lot of interest in our improved forest management on private land protocol. So working really hard to get that one completed soon. And we do have a booth this year, so swing by if you'd like to learn more. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Great, thank you. And Mark Sippola from the California Air Resources Board. Really pleasure to be with you all on the stage here. And thanks to the conference organizers. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of kind of where we've been with the California Cap and Trade program, and take a brief stock, especially on the past few months. So the California program's a mature program. It's proven to be stable, durable market that's helped to effectively reduce GHG emissions. The goal of cap and trade is to reduce emissions. It's important to keep that front and center. And the price of carbon emissions is getting factored into the price of polluting fuels and into decisions that for long-term investments that businesses are making. And as part of California's portfolio of climate policies, it's helped to reduce GHG emissions below our 2020 target in advance of our 2020 target. So again, cap and trade's proven to be stable, adaptable, robust. The program started back in 2012 with our first auction. We had 8 California-only auctions. We're entering our 12th year with emissions obligations now. We just celebrated 10 years of linkage with our linkage partner, Quebec. The program's endured times of political uncertainty in 2016, 2017 around the program, and also broader uncertainty the beginning of 2020 with the pandemic. So there's kind of durability there and proven durability. And throughout its history, entities have been able to understand and comply with the program. So I want to touch on like what's feeding some of that robustness and durability, and it's that understandability and ability to comply. We've seen 100% compliance rate for nearly every compliance event throughout the history. Information about the market is secure, and that's to ensure the market's fair. So we adhere to rigorous policies of protecting data and how we release data. We provide notice of key market activities in advance. We announce market information in a coordinated fashion to ensure that that information is available to all parties that need it at the same time. And we also have requirements, market requirements, and monitoring of those requirements to ensure the integrity of the market. For example, we have registration requirements around disclosures of corporate associations and structures, limits on the amount of allowances that an entity can purchase at auction or hold in their accounts. And we conduct rigorous market monitoring activities along with an independent third-party market monitor to provide an additional level of confidence in the program and its integrity. So when a compliance concern does arise, we take a look at that. There's administrative actions we can take. We can look through financial penalties through settlement agreements, and we can follow through on litigation if that's needed. So there's a range of follow through there. And when the program is updated, as we're currently being considered, It's done through a process that's thoughtful and well-planned and includes a lot of public engagement. So altogether, these design features and these implementation practices have proven to provide a stable, understandable, resilient, and effective program. Right now, what we see in the market, we've got around 330 entities registered, covered entities, around over 400 covered facilities. The program's attracted interest from voluntary participants, in part due to this historic stability, clarity, and smooth functioning of the market. And these voluntary participants can provide some market liquidity, and they can facilitate compliance by the covered entities. The current value of allowances in the market is over $50 billion. We've issued over 258 million compliance credits to various project operators, and that would have a current market value of over $5 billion. So we have had 46 auctions to date, 38 of them jointly with our linkage partner, Quebec. The sale of the state-owned allowances at these auctions in California has raised over $28 billion for our greenhouse gas reduction funds. Those funds get appropriated by our legislature during the annual state budget process. And of that $28 billion, around $10 billion has already been spent on a huge variety of programs, and that's including things like weatherization of low-income housing, expanding clean public transit options, providing community air protection incentives, providing rebates for electric vehicles, and preserving and restoring our public lands. And more than half of these expenditures have been directed towards priority communities. These cap and trade auction proceeds are, in some cases, the only sustained source of funds for many of these critical programs that benefit these priority communities. And prior to cap and trade, this funding mechanisms weren't available. So it's an important benefit to recognize. And these are beyond the benefits of the core GHG reductions that are really the purpose of the program. And these additional expenditures by our legislature have achieved almost 100 million metric tons in additional GHG reductions. Again, beyond the GHG reductions that have been achieved by emitters in the cap and trade program. So the distribution of these allowances via the auction mechanism benefits these state priorities, but some allowances are distributed in a manner that benefits utility ratepayers. Those are the customers of our electric utilities and natural gas utilities. And through the auction of these allowances that are first freely allocated to the utilities, about $15 billion have gone to California's investor-owned utilities, and most of that is returned to the utility customers in the form of a flat climate credit on their bill, and that helps to offset the rate increases for those fuels. In addition to that, $2.2 billion has flowed to the publicly owned utilities, and that value is also being put to a variety of programs to reduce GHG emissions and to support their ratepayers. I'll also note that some allowances are not auctioned and instead are directly provided for free to industrial facilities to mitigate against emissions leakage. The California legislature passed an AB 398 in 2017, and that prescribes some design features of the program, including direction to maximize leakage protection for these industrial facilities. So we continue to monitor for that, and we expect to report to our legislature by the end of 2025 on results of our emissions leakage assessments. To support that report, we've engaged a couple contractors for studies, one looking at prospective forward-looking related to industrial emissions leakage, and another taking a retrospective look at our program for potential emissions leakage within the electricity sector. So coming to the public process, we are initiating a rulemaking process. We have initiated the informal phase of that last year. It's being informed by our new 2045 climate targets and by some efforts in our 2022 scoping plan update, which takes a look at the broader California policies and how we'll get to our overarching climate targets. So we're in that pre-rulemaking phase where we discuss initial concepts, we invite feedback to inform the process. Last year we held 5 public workshops. A couple of them were jointly with Quebec to share some initial concepts and initial thinking about program updates. There can be further updates going forward. Ultimately, there will be a release of a staff proposal with draft regulatory text, with explanations and a staff report, and the needed environmental and economic analyses. Ultimately, our board will hear that proposal at a formal hearing. We're aiming to have that board hearing this year, and there will be continued opportunity to engage and inform the process going forward. So on the scope of those amendments, the big headline is increasing the program's stringency. Again, that's to get the emissions trajectory needed to meet our 2045 targets and to support a long-term carbon price signal across the economy. So that increased stringency means less allowances available, and we've looked at different scenarios where the number of allowances removed from the system ranges from around 115 million up to 390 million. And I described how those allowances are directed to achieve positive outcomes, things like minimizing emissions leakage and protecting ratepayers and achieving the state objectives through additional investments. But less allowances means less available for serving those objectives, and we need to think about how we balance those objectives going forward in a more stringent program. Also, in the context of that more stringent program and the more stringent allowance budgets, we're reviewing some of the market rules to support liquidity, to enhance market protection, and ensure transparent pricing. We're taking a look at some of the cost containment features in that context, and we're assessing provisions to minimize emissions leakage and to support decarbonization and innovation in the industrial sector and in the fuel sector. And we're also accounting for evolving electricity markets in the Western United States. So with respect to those market rules, this is doing our due diligence to review and understand potential market impacts. We want to continue to promote a well-functioning market that offers liquidity and transparent pricing to all stakeholders. And we want to ensure that the market can be effectively monitored and appropriately protected from manipulative and disruptive behavior as it gets more stringent. And it's important to note that the individual concepts shouldn't be considered in isolation, but rather all together and in the context of this more stringent future program that we're envisioning. Any changes to the cost containment structure must aim to minimize costs without compromising the environmental integrity of the program. Potential updates related to industrial allocation include providing mechanisms to minimize leakage associated with new or evolving products, revising certain allocation benchmarks, and providing mechanisms to further incentivize industrial decarbonization. And then on electricity markets, CARB has been actively coordinating where needed to evaluate potential changes to cover transactions and account for any emissions leakage associated with new electricity markets. This is about ensuring that we can accommodate the new electricity markets and not about considering fundamental changes to how electricity imports are regulated by the program. So as a final note, I'll just say that all the changes are being considered in coordination and alongside our linkage partner with Quebec. and any changes will be considered holistically and in a manner that retains that existing linkage. So to summarize, the California program, it's mature, it's got a track record of effectiveness, stability, and integrity. It's designed to be cost effective, to minimize leakage, to protect the utility customers, and it generates additional proceeds that can be used for additional priorities. So goals going forward for the potential amendments are for the program, we're centered on continuing that success while providing a steady long-term carbon price signal to spur longer-term investments in the clean technologies that are needed to further drive reductions down to meet our like mid-century carbon neutrality goals.
Okay, well, thanks very much. It probably shouldn't come as any surprise that when we're talking about compliance markets that have been set up by governments, that process and procedure comes up all the time. I think that over time we've gotten better at that process and procedure. I think we're generally jurisdictions have tried harder to identify and interact with discrete groups and understand their particular needs and that sort of thing. But I just mention all that to say, because I'll say just a couple of minutes on RGGI and the New York program, and they're both in the middle of some pretty full-on process and procedure at the moment. It's probably the summary of where we're at. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative program, which began in 2009, just squeaked in ahead of the California program, but behind the European ETS, is currently in the third program review. You're probably aware of that. The review, which was originally announced on February 2nd, 2021, has dragged on a little longer than everyone expected, I think, and looks like it will drag on a little longer yet. But in part, it's because of the process, and it's also because the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, for anyone who doesn't know, it's relatively narrow. It only obligates electric generation facilities above 25 megawatts. So it's a very thin sort of sliver of the economy, but it's also, it's 10 jurisdictions. And so it's not just one board or one legislature you got to kind of get on board. You've got to get 10 of them on board. And I think that what we're seeing at the moment is a sort of negotiation amongst the states to sort of try and find the sweet spot. And that's kind of part of the delay, as I understand it. Recognizing that in RGGI, they have always gone for consensus. They won't sit down and vote on what to do and have, say, 6 votes for and 4 against and say, well, too bad, we won. That's just not how it works. It'll be a consensus project. And on New York, I would say, and obviously there's an interaction with RGGI because New York State is also a part of the RGGI program. So one of the things they've said is they want to not damage RGGI in the process of setting up their own program. Perhaps goes to what Eva was talking about in terms of federal and state, but different programs working together. And New York has, I think, taken a leaf out of California's book in terms of the pre-rulemaking process, an opportunity to sort of talk about some of the issues with people before they get into the formal process. That's happened over the last year and a bit. They're now at the point where they're ready to shortly issue a formal draft of the program that would then go into rulemaking. They don't have an exact date that they're going to do that, but it should be soon. And I think, again, that's New York really trying to understand the needs of different segments of the economy and different people. And the New York program, unlike RGGI, is much broader and covers the whole economy. And so that's new for them. So I think those sort of, both those jurisdictions are really focusing on the process and how to try and move it forward so that when they get into the formal process, when they get into the formal process, it goes smoother. You know, in Reggie, because it's 10 jurisdictions, once they come up with a draft model rule, it has to go through 10 different rulemaking processes. But having done the work ahead of time to sort of understand the needs and where all the states are, that should make it go more smoothly. So with that, I was just going to ask a couple questions, and then we'll get some questions from the audience. But Eva, I was going to start with you just on this issue of credits from removals versus from reduction or avoidance projects. I know that's something there's been a lot of conversation about that up in Canada, and I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, and you know, this idea that you get credit in a federal program all over the country, even though you've got state programs that may be operating in the same space, and you know.
No, thanks very much. And that actually something that, you know, we've been hearing about in Canada, but also is quite a topic of discussion in some of the sessions yesterday, where we're hearing, I think, that there are some folks that really are thinking about removals as different from offsets and trying to really differentiate those two project types. And I guess in the federal system, we don't differentiate the two. We're prioritizing both. We're prioritizing both reduction projects and removal projects. And really, I think it's an all hands on deck for climate mitigation, and our system can play a key role in trying to bring reductions forward, forward ahead of any regulatory requirements that come into place. So I think that's, you know, an important role that offset systems can play. On removals, we're prioritizing both biological sequestration projects as well as engineered carbon removal. And I think, you know, compliance markets probably have an important role to play in trying to bring those engineered removal projects up to scale by providing really robust quantification methods and rigorous MRV, transparency in the system, and you know, higher value for the credits. So I guess all that to say, there's no distinction in terms of the types of credits. Every offset credit in our system is 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. But on our registry, folks would be able to tell the type of project that generated those credits, would it be reduction or removal one, and kind of use that to inform their decisions about which credits they might want to buy to inform that, you know, that are aligned with their policy objectives.
Okay, and then for both Mark and Joel, there was the announcement this morning of not linkage, but again, more process about working together, you know, exploring, and you know, over on the East Coast, the New York governor, when they first announced the New York Cap and Invest program, had expressed a desire to see it linked with other programs. And frankly, in all my time working in this area, the two conversations that have existed forever are offsets and linkage. So I was just wondering, given this morning's announcement, can you just say a little bit about what's the goal, what's the drive to looking at this, and what do you hope to see come out of it?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to start. So I talked about some of the process steps that Washington is taking. Of course, embedded in the announcement this morning is it takes 3 to tango. We've got these 3 jurisdictions. They all have to move together. But climate change is global, right? So certainly from Washington's perspective, we are benefited not only by having a larger market that brings us price stability, but also because we share a climate. So the more jurisdictions that are committed to robust action to bring down those emissions, the better off Washingtonians are, as well as the economies of scale and the sort of the facilitation of the green economy that develops. So I think those are some key pieces. But I mean, I think underlying all the process is just collaboration and relationships. I mean, linkage works because you have these markets that are designed and work together. And you heard Rajinder say on this morning's panel, and you heard Chair Randolph say in her keynote this morning, that they work really closely with Quebec anytime they're making changes to the program to make sure that those changes are well aligned. We are also having those conversations as well when we're considering changes to our program. We're in conversation with California and Quebec to make sure that everything's working together. Mark, what would you add?
All very good points. Definitely agree with those, and bigger markets tend to be a more efficient market, so that's one key reason. I think another important factor to consider is kind of common business environment. If we two different programs can maybe be a little complicated to manage for larger types of entities that have operations in both jurisdictions. So looking towards a future where there's more common understanding of the broader context and the common business environment is simpler to engage with from the entity's perspective. I'll note that California also has its process for going through linkage. We have Senate Bill 1018, which requires our governor's office to make four specific findings around the stringency of programs, the liability related to the programs, and enforceability. So those are factors we need to take a look at. Staff develops a linkage report. This navigates through the public process. It's important to note that linkage with Washington isn't on the table for this rulemaking that I've been talking about today and that we've been having the informal process on so far. But it could happen, and could be through a follow-up rulemaking process. It would need to be, again, a formal process with a proposed text and proposed rationale, including the added layer of those linkage requirements and findings by our governor and a linkage report by staff. So there's several check boxes to check before getting there, but we've been in conversation. We've been observing the Washington program get set up and running. We like to see a program get up on its feet before kind of taking that next step towards formal linkage. So it's great to see the steps moving forward like that.
Okay. So are there any questions from the audience? I can't see the audience.
And Justin, maybe if I could just jump in for the Canadian perspective on that one too. On the
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, all good.
Hold that thought.
Yeah. Just to say that, we also really recognize the importance of linkage and fungibility and, the role that has in market liquidity. And there actually is some one-way linkage in the Canadian market. So there are certain provincial protocols and credits that are eligible for remittance into the federal output-based pricing system, and no limits on use of who can use federal offset credits. So that would be up to a province to decide whether they would want to accept federal offset credits into their systems, but we'd be open to those conversations.
Cool. Okay, well, thank you. Okay, so we had a question over here.
Hi, this is a question for Mark. I'm Connie Best with the Pacific Forest Trust. And in the course of your discussion of the rulemaking and review of the whole cap and trade program, I didn't hear anything about how offsets is figuring in, at least as a trailing element of that rulemaking. And in particular, I served on the legislatively mandated offsets task force, and we, a couple of years ago, duly prepared a bunch of, I would say, very reasonable and helpful recommendations for improving the program as we were asked to, and nothing has happened in that regard, and I assume it's in line somewhere. So maybe you can enlighten us about next steps with offsets.
I will note that we did have, thanks for the question and thanks for your efforts on the task force. We did have a workshop a while back related to looking at the forest offset protocol. And we are undertaking some technical discussions. We're not fully through our informal process yet, so I'll note that. And there are elements of the offsets program that we are assessing for potential consideration for this round. So, there's not too much more I can say, but we've talked about that being one area to look at, but we haven't had that public discussions yet, but I expect some of those to be forthcoming.
Okay, other questions? There's a question over in the back, or about the middle.
Thank you. This is also for Mark, related to IFM projects and offsets. And I was just curious that recently, or over the last couple years, there's been quite a backlog of getting projects reviewed. And I just wondered if the California ARB is doing anything to increase staffing, or do you feel like things are working just fine and the review is happening in a timely enough manner? Because I work on developing IFM projects, and it's been a little bit frustrating to the extended wait times.
I hear the concerns. We and welcome conversations offline as well if you've got considerations or additional thoughts. I'll say we don't have a great amount of flexibility at the state to simply wind up additional staff when we need it. But we are, very thorough, and we want to ensure the integrity. And so when questions do come up, we, take a close look, and we work with the registries and the verifiers to make sure that every credit that we issue into the market has integrity. That can take a significant amount of time in some cases. I will acknowledge that there's probably some additional delays right now, and happy to consider approaches to alleviating that current concern.
Okay, back further.
Hi, my name is Devin McReel. I work for a utility in Washington State. My question's for Joel, but really for the entire panel. One thing I'm curious about, ballot initiative 2117, a lot of nebulousness. Somebody in an earlier session yesterday made a really interesting comment, asking if people thought it was potentially a harbinger of things to come for all the markets, right? Not just potentially impacting the Washington market. So really, I guess I'm interested in everybody's thoughts on the status of that. Obviously, I know there's not so much you can say about it, but the status of that both within your market and kind of in the global carbon markets, or I guess the national carbon markets perspective.
Thanks for the question. I'm happy to take it first, but would be curious to hear from others as well. And I'll start with the caveat that as a state employee, I'm not allowed to take any position, pro or con, on the initiative, but I will say, of course, we live in a democracy. We live in a state that has the initiative process. California also has the initiative process, and its program has been challenged over the years. As agency staff, our job is to carry out the programs as the statute and the rules require us to. Our program right now is working as intended, and we see it being pretty successful, and we're going to continue carrying it out unless and until our direction changes.
See, I might just weigh in because I come from a state that does not have a ballot initiative process, so we don't have them. But I think the broader question, the reality is that these programs are created in almost all cases by legislative action, and they, that necessarily means that they can be changed by that action or other actions that are built into the laws of the jurisdiction. And so I think it's certainly something that everyone I know who works on these things keeps in mind. And but I guess to Joel's point, operating the program as it's intended and making sure that it's meeting the requirements of the law, I think is really important. And you know, when Reggie first got started, you know, we were very careful to, and there was a lot of concern early on with these programs that you know, it was interesting. There was concern about collusion. The environmental groups were concerned that industry would collude to keep the price too low. Industry was concerned that environmental groups would collude to keep the price too high. The program staff in the middle were just concerned that we ran an auction that didn't have collusion in it and met all the requirements. And I think to date, you know, 64 odd auctions later, that's largely, I'd say almost 100% is the way it's happened. And so these things will come up and I guess they'll get dealt with, but I don't know what else any of us could really say about it, right? There's a question right in the middle here.
Hi, my name is Claire. I'm working for a regulated entity in Quebec, so be indulgent for my English accent. My question is for Eva. Since this morning we mentioned offsets protocol, which imply avoided emission. We also mentioned clean fuel regulation, and there is a Canadian clean fuel regulation in force. And clean fuel regulation took the angle of carbon intensity reduction, which imply also avoiding emissions. So I would like to hear you regarding the cohabitation when there is avoiding emission in two different kind of regulation, and how does it cohabitate?
So let me see if I'm understanding your question. Are you asking about the interactions between the clean fuel regulations and carbon pricing systems?
More the clean fuel regulation and the offsets protocol when they are avoided emission, because in CI score calculation we can take into account avoided emission. So just maybe a clarification whether for cohabitation.
Okay, yeah, so both, I mean, offsets obviously has crediting opportunities, and the clean fuel regulations also has crediting opportunities, but it's not possible to generate credits under both systems for the same thing. So it's really important for the credits that are generated on the offset system to be unique. And so there are some areas of overlap, for example, in landfill methane recovery projects where it could be possible to generate credits under both systems, but they would be for different activities, and it would need to be done in a way to make sure that we're not awarding a ton for this credit for the same ton of reduction that would have been achieved under the clean fuel regulations. So they're distinct that way.
Okay, well, we've actually reached time, and I don't want to keep everyone here all the way through lunch, because that'll get me in trouble with, most importantly, you guys, and then probably the organizers after that. But so I want to thank the panelists for their time. I thank for making time to come out here, and thank you all for coming along. And we're all going to be around at least through lunch, right? So if you want to catch up with any of us, you can do that. So thank you. Thank you.